I'm Judy Greenway. I'm 79 years old. I was born in Scotland and I live in London, England. Well, I had quite a disrupted childhood. My family moved many times, including to other countries. And I went to 9 different schools, state schools, most of them. Well, all of them, in fact. And well, I'll talk a bit later on about how that affected my politics, as far as I can tell. Yeah, so family life was difficult and quite rootless in many ways. And so reading and school was in some ways a refuge for me. And I decided that I wanted to go to university, which nobody else, to my knowledge, in my family had done, and which was also at the time, which this is in the early 1960s, only a minority of people went to university, and a tiny minority of those were girls. I was the only girl. I went to a grammar school, which is more academically inclined within the state school system at the time, but I was the only girl to even apply for university in my year. So, yeah, I thought this was going to be an escape to a different kind of life, and in many ways it was. So I went first of all to the University of East Anglia to study English and history, which were basically the subjects I'd done best at school, although I wasn't very interested in history, in fact, at that point. While there, I discovered philosophy, and I eventually switched over to doing a degree in philosophy instead. I went to another university to do that in Birmingham. And after I graduated from there, I went to Oxford to do postgraduate work. And from there, I went to my first job in London, which was an academic job at the University of East London, as it now is. As it then was, it was North East London Polytechnic. And the polytechnics were a new introduction into the education system. And they were they did some degree level work, but also other kinds of qualifications. And it was very much oriented towards the workplace and practicality and so on. And it drew on, or purported to did in fact draw on a very different class base for its students. And I was very attracted by this, particularly having come from Oxford, where I was quite unhappy. And I wanted to get out of the ivory tower, really. So I joined what was called the Department of Applied Philosophy, where we taught across a whole number of different courses, what would now probably be called liberal studies, I think, to trying to introduce some broader aspect of thought and ideas to students who are studying science and engineering and architecture and so on. And the institution underwent many changes over the years, and so did I, but I stayed there, moving from different departments. I started out in the Applied Philosophy Department, which then became the Science and Technology Studies Department. I then started teaching in Cultural Studies, where eventually I moved. I was able to take my interest in women and women's history and so on into the Cultural Studies Department, and my interest in history deepened there. And I spent the rest of my working life in the same, but also the very different institution, which, as I said, later became a university and much more attempting to run along more traditional university lines. And my emphasis was throughout on teaching rather than research or administrative work, which the latter of which I actively avoided as much as I possibly could. And and I retired. And here I am, still doing my own research and pottering away, basically. Well, I think my politics were probably, first of all, inflected, at least, by my childhood experiences. The thing about going to 9 different schools is that you get a very clear idea of how utterly ludicrous and arbitrary many of the rules by which institutions are run. I mean, if you're in one school to begin with, that's just how it is. And you learn the rules and that's it. And then you go somewhere else and the rules are utterly different. You're getting into trouble for doing things that you were meant to do in the previous school, and so on and so forth. So I think that had probably quite a big impact on me. And although I did well at school, I actually actively hated it, and it seemed like prison for children. It's also a place of violence as well, because throughout my time in various schools, corporal punishment was possible, although it was, in England anyway, practiced mainly on the boys, but nevertheless acted as sort of a source of fear for everybody, I think. The other thing about my family life being difficult and disrupted is that it gave me, I think, a clear hatred of the sort of hypocrisy of the very repressive society within which I'd grown up, which is particularly for girls, 50s Britain primarily, very narrow ideas about conformity and respectability, and and the sacredness of the family, which of course wasn't actually sacred at all. So adults appeared to me to be massive hypocrites in terms of the difference between public and private behaviour. In my family, I don't recall politics being discussed. My parents were conservatives with a small c, but I never heard them talk about politics or political events. In fact, although really the family didn't talk much about anything, so maybe that doesn't explain very much. So my interest in politics began, such as it did, from the impact of more public events. And the first public event I can remember making any impression on me at all was in 1955. A woman called Ruth Ellis was executed for being involved in the murder of her lover. And she was the last woman to be executed in this country. And there was actually a huge campaign against it, which merged in with a more wide campaign against capital punishment as such at the time. I wasn't really aware of any of that. All I knew was that this woman was going to be killed by the state, and that lots of people thought this was wrong. And there was a big campaign to try and get her sentence commuted. So the first political thing I can remember is hearing over the radio when I was 9 years old that Ruth Ellis was executed that morning. And that just struck a chill to my heart, really, that the state, which was meant to look after you, could kill somebody in cold blood. So I don't really remember anything else from around those years in terms of public events. The next thing I remember, and did have a much more long-lasting impact in some ways, was in 1960 when I was 14, the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa. I mean, not everybody knows about this now, but it was a massive demonstration of Black South Africans against the past laws which controlled their movement. And it was a peaceful, non-violent demonstration. And this huge crowd of 5,000 people, the police suddenly opened fire on them, killed nearly 100, and wounded many others. Many people were shot in the back as they were running away. And I knew nothing about international politics, or indeed politics with a big P at all at this point. But I knew that this was a terrible, wrong thing. And I knew also, I think, that a little bit about the civil rights movement in the United States, and that Black people there were also fighting for a better world for themselves and indeed for everybody. I think ever since then, South Africa and the fight against apartheid and for South African liberation was very important to me, and I was involved at various moments, at different times, in movements connected by that. But also, I suppose it's the beginning of my realization about British colonialism and imperialism, which I knew also nothing about. We didn't learn anything at school about those things, other than, we celebrated things like Empire Day and so on. Beginning to become more aware of outside events, but not politics, not party politics. I didn't really know anything much about. But during the early 60s, I was also aware of and read about campaigns for various aspects of social liberalization, campaigns against the criminalization of homosexuality, for reproductive rights. Those would be two of the most important ones. Oh, and for divorce laws to be liberalized as well, because divorce was very difficult. The fact that my parents got divorced was also a source of shame and scandal, really. I didn't know anybody else with divorced parents at all throughout my whole childhood. But it seemed to me that divorce was a good thing if you were in an unhappy marriage, and that it ought to be made easier. So there were those kinds of struggles going on internationally. There were the sort of things going on nationally that I agreed with. But again, I thought politicians, trade unions, all those kinds of institutions, they didn't have anything to say to me. There was a campaign for nuclear disarmament going on as well at the time, this same time in the early 60s. And although I kind of agreed with nuclear disarmament, I was quite cynical about the possibility of protest doing any good whatsoever. So, I didn't want to join or really have anything to do with it. I thought they were wasting their time. I was quite cynical about those kinds of possibilities. So I was very much becoming an individualist, really. Now, in my last year at school, we read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And reading this, I wrote an essay which was about the notion of freedom. I was also influenced by my reading outside of school of Nietzsche, I think, at this point. So there's a sort of weird soup of Mill and Nietzsche going around in my head. But I wrote, as a consequence, I wrote an essay which concluded that anarchism was the only thing that made sense in terms of bringing about a situation of social freedom. So my whole argument tends toward this. And then my last sentence, which I remember, although I no longer have the essay, is, but anarchism is impossible. So that's what I thought then. But not very long afterwards, I met somebody who had previously been at my school and was now on holiday. And he told me that he was an anarchist. And I thought, oh, a real person who I like and have a respect for can be an anarchist. And this began, I think, this was really important to me, to see that it wasn't just an intellectual idea that had no purchase in the world, but that real people could hold to these ideas and try to incorporate them into their lives. And one day he and I hitched up to London. I was living in a small town at this point. We hitched up to London to go to a meeting, which I don't really know exactly what it was, but I think it was something like it either was the Anarchist Federation or it was attempting to set up an Anarchist Federation anyway. So we turned up, two teenagers at this basement full of what seemed to me, in my ageist way, to be a load of beardy old men. And the they were getting into an argument about whether or not to have a vote on how to proceed. So it became a very sort of technical and very heated argument. And I sort of thought, I don't think this is quite what I was looking for. Except that, of course, there again, they were real people, and indeed older people, who cared about these ideas. So I started calling myself an anarchist, and I started subscribing to some anarchist papers. And when I went to the University of East Anglia, their library subscribed to Anarchy magazine, which at that time was edited by Colin Ward, who I think has probably been one of the most influential anarchist thinkers for me. And what Anarchy magazine was about at that point, under his editorship, was anarchy and everyday life. And he was saying anarchism can be found everywhere. Anarchism is an idea which applies to all aspects of life. It's not just about one thing. So you can talk about prisons, you can talk about schools, you can talk about housing, and you can be active in campaigns around all of those. And anarchist ideas are relevant. And this was a huge thing for me. And I think that's really determined the sort of anarchism that I was interested in, which is an anarchism of the everyday, anarchism of practical involvement in day-to-day things. So while I was at university, I began joining local rather than national groups of things like Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. I went on my first ever demonstration, hitchhiked up to London again to go on one of the big CND marches of the time. And that was, again, very exciting just to see large numbers of people who cared about the same kinds of things I did. But mentioning CND, I also should mention that I think throughout I have been a pacifist, a believer in non-violent activism of all kinds. When I was at Birmingham University, I was in a local anarchist discussion group there, and I gave a talk, my first ever talk to anybody, about the logical connections between anarchism and pacifism. And I've never forgotten that at the end of that, one of the people in the group said to me that my logic was he couldn't fault my logic in any way, but nevertheless, he wasn't convinced. Now, up until that point, I'd thought education and logic will take people to the right answers about things. And I suddenly realized that you need far more. You need to think about all sorts of different things if you're actually going to persuade people of their ideas. And retrospectively, I also know that you can not convince somebody at the time, but they can nevertheless go away and think about what you said and maybe later on change their mind. But I think that's only years of teaching and political activism that have taught me that you don't always see the results straight away of what you do or say. I was somewhat involved in student politics, particularly during 1968, the year of student revolutions. Indeed, international student and worker uprisings, revolutions, strikes, occupations, etc., etc. So I was at Birmingham University then, and although I can't remember our specific demands, I think they were around student democracy, things which are taken for granted in universities now, but were not then, that students should have any say whatsoever in what their education actually consisted of or how it should be done. And I took part in the occupation of the administrative offices at Birmingham University at the time, and that was also very exciting. And one of the things I was very impressed with then, the anarchist group I belonged to was a local group, not a student group. But I was very impressed to see that the student anarchist group during the occupation had organized a kind of cloakroom, safe space for people to leave their belongings, and just manage the business of doing an occupation. In other words, they were really concerning themselves on a very practical level with the day-to-day life of the occupation, whereas some of the other student politicos were, in the Great Hall singing the Internationale and waving their fists. The anarchists were actually doing something that helped to make the whole thing possible and livable. And I think that was an important lesson too. So, I was involved in the campaign against the Vietnam War, campaigns against chemical and biological warfare, particularly the campus connections with those. Eventually, I went to Oxford, as I've mentioned before, and there I was in a college that was for students who came from outside Oxford, many of whom were from overseas. And I was introduced there to revolutionaries, Marxists, activists who came from all over the world, USA war resistors, anti-apartheid activists from South Africa, and so on and so forth. So again, it's about making international connections, but also theoretical connections, but also seeing that it's real people doing these things. And that may sound ridiculous, but the point is, having been brought up, and I think this is still the case for many people, anarchism seems ridiculous. The idea of changing the world seems ridiculous or impossible, or impossible. And I think, the important struggle we have on our hands is to try and make those things seem not impossible. The other thing I wanted to say that I think I learned was learning there as my knowledge of politics and international politics grew, is that an individualist approach is not enough, that you have to have the world has to change, societies have to change. You can't have individual freedom unless everyone is free. Freedom and solidarity have to go together at all times. When I came to work in a permanent job for the first time, I moved to London. So I was in a big city as opposed to the small places that I'd lived for most of my life, where all sorts of things were going on. So that was in itself very exciting. Towards the end of my time as a student, the women's liberation movement had begun, and I'd met some American feminists in Oxford who talked to me about women's liberation, which again I hadn't particularly identified with to begin with, because I just thought, I'm an individual, I'm different. And they began to convince me that that wasn't the case, and that women had things in common that made a movement both possible and necessary. So the first thing I did when I came to London, apart from finding somewhere to live, was I got in touch with the women's liberation movement. In London, there was this organisation group called the Women's Liberation Workshop, and it acted as a coordinating centre for women's liberation groups all over the country. And so I went along to this tiny room full of filing cabinets, the telephone, and a voluntary worker. And basically, she looked in the filing cabinet and told me that there was an a women's liberation group in the area I'd moved to, which was a working class area of London. And I got in touch with them and I joined, and that was a real major transformation in my life. And I also found my local anarchist group, which was a group called East London Libertarians, and I joined them as well. So those two things went side by side for many years. A women's liberation workshop and the women's liberation movement in this country was organised on extremely what I'd call libertarian or anarchist lines. There was no leadership. There was no central organisation that made decisions. It was a federation of groups, and decisions were made by discussions within groups who then reported back to large meetings, which then might make a decision about having a conference and what issues would be discussed at the conference and so on. And then at conferences, anybody in the movement could go and take part and vote about whether to accept a particular demand as part of the movement or not. And meetings were organised in this generally, and except in very large groups. We would sit in circles. We would not be giving, at conferences, we would not be giving papers. Somebody might start off a discussion, or a group might say, we want to talk about this issue, this is what we're going to talk about today, and then everybody would contribute. And what we all learned in our small groups was how to make sure that everybody got the space to speak and to be listened to. And I don't think there's a better way of organising, and I was pleased to see that kind of way of organising has become much more widely practiced in other forms of organisations over the years. Within the women's liberation movement, there was also a strong anarchist feminist current. So I was in apart from being in my local group, which was the local group was very educational in that it had women from a whole variety of different political backgrounds, although I say a variety, that would spread from, I guess, from liberalism to far left and wherever you want to place anarchism on or outside that spectrum, but also from a very different variety of backgrounds, working or non-working situation, mothers and non-mothers, straight and lesbian. So I learned an enormous amount in that small group about what women do and don't have in common, but how you can act together around those things that you do have in common to begin to affect change. And I made friendships then that have lasted the whole of the rest of my life. And the anarchist feminist groups did all sorts of things. So one of the first ones that I helped to organise was about the need for feminism within anarchism. It was about sexism within the anarchist movement. Because I haven't said before, but I think every single group or conference or, practically anything anarchist related that I went to for decades, I would either be the only woman or one of the tiny number of women present in a particular group or meeting. And this is even from groups that I was, quite happy in other ways within. So women were in a minority and women's issues were not taken seriously. Plus, at that time, and I think before and since, many male anarchist ideas of sexual liberation were just about easy sexual access to as many women as possible. And although I was in favour of open relationships, I wasn't in favour of that kind of attitude. So anyway, so there were meetings about what was wrong with the anarchist movement as it stood, but those meetings were only really appealed to women who had been active within the anarchist movement and were unhappy with it. But also coming to anarchist feminist groups of various kinds were women who wanted to find out more about anarchism. So we had reading groups where we would read all sorts of things, from Emma Goldman's autobiography, which was reprinted in the early 1970s, pamphlets that were coming out from anarchist feminists in America and Europe, looking also at ideas from situationism. We looked at Murray Bookchin's post-scarcity anarchism. We looked at socialist feminist writings about things like women's healthcare, a whole range of things. So we did read, a small amount of Kropotkin, Bakunin, etc. But we weren't looking for a spelt out doctrine. We were looking to see what ideas made sense to us with our lives and the questions that we were trying to deal with in our lives and in our political activism more generally. So there were conferences, and there was an anarchist feminist newsletter, and all sorts of things which are almost entirely ignored by many of the historians that have written about the women's liberation movement of the time. And partly that's because we were not very good, I think, at keeping records and thinking about publicizing ourselves in a different kind of way. It was all about doing the activism of today. And it took a feminist historian, Sheila Rowbottom, who wrote Women, Resistance and Revolution, which was one of the books that we were quite influenced by, which had a whole lot about anarchist women, although she was not at that time identifying herself as an anarchist. And she said to us, you must put the dates on things. And that never occurred to us. We would just sort of say, conference on July the 7th. We wouldn't put on the poster, conference on July the 7th, 1972, because we all knew it was 1972. But of course, looking back, you're completely mystified. I've looked in my diary before doing this talk, and it just says things like conference, meeting. And half the time, although there were very large numbers of them, and sometimes there's more information than that, often there isn't. And I think that matters, because I think we need to know what is going on now, but also what has gone on, and how those two things are linked. I was in a gay anarchist group for a while, having changed my ideas about my own sexuality during my time in women's liberation. But I was the only woman in that. And although one of the other people in it was a close friend, I felt that the issues they discussed were very specific to men. And so I didn't stay in that group. I was also involved in gay organizing within my union, and also in my teaching. A colleague and I were able to introduce an option on lesbian and gay cultures into the cultural studies and other humanities degree undergraduate options. And I think that was the first, or one of the first, of such things in an academic setting. And I was originally very suspicious about doing anything relating to my politics, like women's liberation or anarchism or gay politics. I felt uneasy about bringing these into an academic context and becoming something that students felt obliged to learn, that they might have to be marked on, part of the whole academic rigmarole, which, as something as an anarchist, you can't help but have unease about those kinds of things. But it was often student demand. They wanted to know about these things. And of course, you can only know about those things if people are speaking and writing about them in all contexts. So although my writing nearly all my life has been for journals and publications outside the realm of academia, and most of my talks and things were for many years outside of academia, in the end, the two things became closer together for me. Although I still feel some unease, but then I can see that the project that you're doing, Philip, is something that's been made possible by anarchist academics, amongst other people. And you're beginning to make some of those interconnections happen, which I think is very important. It's the challenge to domination, it's the challenge to hierarchy, it's the recognition of the operation of power in all spheres of life, and the attempt to challenge that, and the attempt to develop alternatives to that without necessarily, not essentially not providing blueprints or doctrines which have to be followed to the letter, but saying we have to try something different. We'll try this, we'll try that, and but the important thing behind trying all those things, whether it's a campaign or a change in living situations or a change in social relationships more generally, is that you try things out, and if they don't work, you try something else. You don't say it has to be like this, or it has to be like that, or you have to follow this doctrine or else. Obviously, not every anarchist organization or movement or person lives up to that in all, or sometimes it seems in any respects. But that's something to be moved towards, really. Well, I do identify myself as an anarchist. And I think it's important to be able to do that, because I think the whole notion of the impossibility or ridiculousness of anarchism can only be overcome if more and more people are willing to say that they are anarchists. And the pressure, I mean, obviously, when it's safe to do so, obviously, I mean, I'm talking from a situation where in this country so far, there's nothing unsafe about saying that. But if you are in a situation where it's safe to do so, then I think you should do so, at least in those contexts where anarchism is being represented or belittled. I mean, it's like the whole thing about people saying it's important to come out if you're gay. You know, that whole debate about coming out in the 1970s also. That if nobody ever says what they are and just tries to conceal that, then it becomes something shameful. And you get, publishers will say, oh, don't mention that this person that you're writing a biography was an anarchist. Can't you call them something else? Oh, don't say you're an anarchist because that will put people off. But that will never stop being shameful or disreputable or unthinkable if people who are in a position to do so don't actually claim that identity. But having said that, you don't have to push that in all situations. I don't always say I am an anarchist. I say it when it seems to me important to do so. I think the important thing is what you're involved with and how you behave within those contexts. And also, being an anarchist, what does it mean, even? It means believing in something, but that something is not fixed. It's fixed insofar as it's a way of being, a way of approaching, a way of asking certain kinds of questions about power and domination and how they might best be resisted, overcome, replaced by other kinds of organizing. But it's not a fixed thing, and it's not a fixed destination. Can anybody actually be an anarchist, or is it just something that you aim towards, or a way of moving towards something that you want, which is what many people who don't call themselves anarchists want, which is peace, social justice, a better relationship with the environment, and all those kinds of things. Anarchism is a way of trying to do that, which we think is better than other ways of trying to do that. But I think anarchist history is really important, not just because that's what I spend a lot of my time doing now, but because it shows you that people can do things in the past that worked for a while. And no, they didn't work forever, but then nothing works forever. Things change. Somebody born now is born into a completely different world. Even within the same country, they're born into a completely different world with completely different immediate practical problems to deal with, different understandings about what the future might be. And looking at the past and making connections with people who've experienced the past. And it's a very weird experience becoming history, which is what I guess is happening with something like this interview, is it brings it home on a very personal way. I'm the same person I've been all along, but the world is very different from the way it was when I started, and some things that have changed. We never get the world we think we wanted. We never get the goals we think we wanted. But we do get things that often go unnoticed, or it goes unnoticed that they came because of struggle. I had no idea that any of the things I valued in the society I lived in when I was 20 had come about because other people had struggled for them. My parents had, there'd been the World War, and it had been struggled to save the world from fascism, as understood at the time. But the idea that things like, the welfare state, any kind of rights and freedoms that existed had been fought for and won very painfully over many years of struggle. I didn't understand that. And I think it is important to understand that. And it's important for old people to understand that the world is different now, and it's going to go on being different. The things that I thought were important are not necessarily the most important things now, but the important things underlying that are things we can carry on moving towards in our own awkward and imperfect ways. Well, I think that's unanswerable, really. I think anarchism will go on being relevant in any kind of future, however it's able to be expressed. Whether and how there is a movement is something I can't really speak to. That's never been terribly strong in this country. I think an anarchist movement of any kind can only have any strength if it's what large numbers of people think they want. In other words, you have to create a society where people want things to be different and they want things to be done differently. You can't get to a different kind of society if you fight it in the same old violent, hierarchical ways. So I don't know what the future is for anarchist movements or anarchist individuals, but I do know that it has to start from recognizing that we have to be able to communicate to large numbers of people in small ways that life could be other than what it appears to be now. And I think of the moments when I've felt the excitement of some other thing being possible, whether that's been going to my first gay pride event, which was tiny, but coming out of the underground station and seeing a whole load of people like me out in public with their flags and their banners and their badges. And this is in a world where, being gay was secret for most people. That was really exciting, made you feel the world could be different. Sleeping in an administrative office during a student occupation. That felt like the world turned upside down, even if it was only for a few weeks. Standing on a picket line and having people honk in support. That feels different. It's in those small moments when people can visualize something different, and it can be something much, much more basic and practical than any of those things, It could be fighting for road safety for children in your area. It could be fighting for books to be available in schools that are not currently available. It can be all those kinds of things where people feel the power, the possibility of things being different. And anarchists have to concentrate on that, I think, to have a movement that is capable of sustaining itself. And I think that will be true anywhere. Because a revolution that only takes its acolytes along with it is not going to last.